Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to Where We All Belong, Building an Anti-Racist World online forum. Before we begin tonight's program, we would like to acknowledge the complicated space in which we are having this conversation. There has been an insurgence of verbal and physical violence that people of Asian descent have experienced in the U.S. and around the world because of anti-Asian racism. Last week, 8 people were murdered in Georgia, 6 of whom were of Asian descent. Hopkins Schools rejects racism, xenophobia, and nativism and stands with those who have been harmed by all form of anti-Asian incidences. We want to acknowledge that since the pandemic began, we have faced traumatizing events at a national and local level. The insurgents at our nation's capital, the murder of George Floyd, and many other men and women of color, and the recent shooting of Colorado, and countless other social injustices that have left us reeling. To pay tribute to the gravity of this moment and to honor the victims, please join us in a moment of silence.
Thank you. This event is designed for parents and guardians of tweens and teens to provide tools and tips on how to navigate conversations about race and racism with your child. However, no matter who you are, while you are here, we warmly welcome you and hope you find this conversation helpful.
This event is presented by Hopkins Public Schools, West and North Junior High. You'll watch this live on Eventbrite or access the chat and live video on YouTube. If you cannot see the chat on YouTube, please refresh your page.
To introduce ourselves, Annie and I are excited to be the moderators for this event.
My name is Annie Palm. I'm a senior at Hopkins High School and have attended West Junior High and Glen Lake Elementary.
And my name is Patton. I'm a senior at Hopkins High School and have attended both North and West Junior High. Tonight we will have 2 speakers. Julius Eromosele is the principal of Hopkins North Junior High and is an expert in racial equity and education. He has been sought out by local media such as NPR and WCCO. Julius, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Annie. A pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Julius Eromosele. I am the principal at Hopkins North Junior High. It is an honor to be here in this forum with you all. A little bit about myself. I was born in Nigeria. I immigrated to the United States at the age of 13. Grew up in St. Paul, attended the University of Minnesota. And you know, I've worked in Osseo area schools and a number of charters around the Twin Cities area. So I guess in that way, I'm kind of homegrown in that sense. I have, being here at Hopkins has been just an amazing experience. To be in a district that is deeply committed to the fight against racial injustice and the upliftment of our community and all the people in it. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. Dr. Leanne Kampfe is the principal of Hopkins West Junior High and is an award-winning principal for her leadership skills. She is guiding her school and ensuring all students have access to a quality education. Leanne, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Annie and Ari and Julius. Like he said, I am also very honored to be here. This is my 24th year in education, and I have worked in South Dakota and Minnesota exclusively. 14 of those years were as a teacher here in Hopkins. And I am also really, really grateful that we are having this conversation. A good friend of mine not too long ago said that it is more important for us to be good story makers than good storytellers. And so I hope that this can be the start of a better story for our children because we owe that to them.
Thank you both for telling us a little about yourselves. A couple housekeeping notes before we get to the questions. The purpose of this event is to have an authentic discussion about race and racism and to provide parents and caregivers with some tools to help you navigate these conversations with your children. The relationship between school and home can be critical in supporting you in your journey. This is a complex topic with multiple layers. It requires introspection, patience, and tenacity. You may experience discomfort during this conversation, and that's okay. We are so glad that you are here with us tonight and excited to begin to build a better, kinder world together.
We will be asking Principal Eromosele and Principal Kampfe questions pre-submitted by the audience, which will cover topics such as microaggressions, tricky situations, and the relationship between home and school in the context of anti-racism work. These questions were submitted during the event registration process.
If you are watching this video in Eventbrite and would like to submit a question live, click on the YouTube logo in the lower right-hand corner of the video player and sign into YouTube to access the chat. If you are already on YouTube, simply leave your question in the chat. If you don't see chat on your screen, refresh your browser window. We will leave time at the end of the event to answer a couple of these questions. This event will end at 7:30 p.m.
Without further ado, let's get into the questions. Why is the topic of anti-racism so important to be having right now, both in schools and at home? Leanne, can we start with you?
Sure. I think the first thing that I would say is that this topic is not just important right now. This topic has been important for hundreds of years. Our country has a history that makes this topic important. And so I am grateful that many people have become more aware of the importance of this topic in the last year or so. But I certainly would never say that this is now the time to talk about it, because we are far past due talking about it. I think our children are ready. I think our children have been ready, and I think they are waiting on us. And that's not unique to my generation. My generation waited on the previous generation too. But I've told some of my younger employees that I need them to speak up about all of this, because it's time to stop waiting. It's time to start having those conversations and taking action and doing things differently. And if we aren't talking about it in our schools and our homes, then we are signaling it's not important. And so that's one of the biggest reasons that we have to be having the conversations, but we also have to be ready to take some action.
How can we provide answers and resources to our children if we don't understand everything about anti-racism ourselves? Julius, let's have you start this one.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. This is a very important question in that a lot of families, I think, have had to really struggle with this last year in dealing with all the racial strife that has, kind of reared its head through the pandemic and all that is going on in our country. But there is an opportunity here, right, for families to truly engage in this conversation in a meaningful way. I once heard that denial is the heartbeat of racism, right? And so what this last year and this moment allows us to do is really dig in and stare these racist kind of practices in the face and really attacking the issue. Families send their kids to schools to be ready for the future, right? And in a lot of ways, the future is now. And in order to thrive in the future as a contributing member of society, we have to be able to live and coexist in a way that is deeply meaningful for everyone. And that means as a school, we have a responsibility to prepare all of our kids for what the future brings. So it is important to engage in this anti-racist work. It's not enough to just be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. And so parents have to be willing to engage in these conversations. I read an article once by sociologist Franz Twine, and it's around the idea of racial literacy. And the idea of racial literacy is that when Black and brown kids are growing up, we are being taught that, hey, as a Black child, as a brown-skinned child, there's a certain way you have to behave because race is ever present in how you interact with the world. Now, let's flip that. White families now have to start considering, how do you raise racially literate kids, right? And that is a deeply important question that we have to ask ourselves. And it means we cannot be in denial about what privileges come with being a white person and how that impacts your kids' friends and the people they associate with on a regular basis.
I so appreciate what you said about that, Julius. I agree with you 100%, and know that from my own experience, that it was something that I did not think about until I was a teacher. So in my 20s, that's when I first started to realize just all the differences that existed amongst people. And I think what's tough is that it's a feature of white culture to need to be right and to need to know exact answers, right? And so sometimes I think that we aren't talking about it because we feel like we don't have the answer. And so then we think we don't talk about it at all. And there isn't a right answer, because if there were, we'd be in a different spot right now. The world would be a different place, right? So I guess wanting families to know that this isn't about you being able to explain it. It's not about you being able to say, well, here's what you should do instead. It's a personal journey. You have to examine yourself first. And then once you really know yourself, then you are able to help others around you. And so I think you do need to start talking with children about it, even if you haven't yourself already done that work. But the first time a child asks a question, that is your cue that it's time to think about this if you haven't been thinking about it already, and that it's about figuring it out together. It isn't about having right answers.
That is a great point, Dr. Kampfe, because I think it's the idea of living intentionally and living in the moment, right? And not letting a teachable moment pass you by as a family. And unfortunately, we live in a society where these moments are often captured on audio and videotape now, right? So there is plenty of opportunities to engage in this conversation. And to not engage in it is malpractice as a parent, honestly. And so it's deeply important that when the opportunities come up, you don't act like it's not important, and also acknowledge how it impacts you differently because of the skin tone that you have. Acknowledge that the kids that your son or your daughter plays basketball with or hockey with, race impacts them a little differently. And so how can they be supportive of their classmates and their friends who they interact with on a daily basis and who they love? And the world is sending them a message that these people are inherently less than. And so we have to combat that thinking that we unintentionally plant in our children.
Yeah, I think students, people my age, we're ready to have these conversations. We're here, we're seeing the world just like adults are, even in a different way. So I think your responses are just really powerful. Can you explain microaggressions and what action should be taken if we see microaggressions happening? Leanne, do you want to start?
Sure. I was thinking about this. I feel like microaggressions probably always existed, but I think that they have become prevalent, I suppose, in the 20th century when people started to develop awareness of how wrong it is to judge other people because of any facet of their personality, right? And so then a microaggression becomes this way that you can do that without admitting you're doing it, I think. Like put someone in their place, make them understand this is how we do things here. And it can be like a look. It can be saying what I just said. I mean, I don't, since I'm a white person, I haven't experienced that frequently. I would say that as an administrator, there have been times where people walk into the room and I'm with a group of men and they automatically assume that the male is the principal. They automatically assume that the man is the one in charge and they start to ask the man questions. So I would consider that a microaggression because it's an assumption that because of me being a female, I can't be a leader. I wouldn't be a leader, right? And so I think it's these little subtle things that there's no way it feels subtle to the person it's happening to, right? That constantly reinforce whiteness in all spaces is how I would describe it. What are we going to do about it? We have to interrupt it. And I think that because it's subtle, that makes it trickier. Like people feel like they aren't capable of having a big response or they aren't sure a big response is appropriate. And I guess I don't know why not. I do know that for myself, anytime that I'm feeling uncomfortable, microaggression or not, that I often will ask questions because that can get people to pause. So if I were to see somebody or hear that, I might say, hey, tell me more about what you mean by that. What do you mean? And then that kind of forces them to like acknowledge what they're doing. But I also think it would be perfectly appropriate to say, hey, that's not okay. Stop, right? I think that so many people in our society are conflict avoidant. That's a huge thing in the Midwest and Scandinavian culture. And so I think you have to be prepared. And if you don't feel like you can say the direct statement, then ask the question. But don't be silent. Don't let that pass by.
You're so right, Leanne. And the example of microaggression that you shared there of someone walking into a space and assuming the man in the room is the principal and not you, right? Like, let's call it what that is. That is just absolutely sexist, right? And when it comes to microaggressions as it relates to race, let's call that what it is. It's absolutely racist, right? I think a lot of folks think racism means wearing a white hood, riding a horse and planting a cross on someone's lawn to burn it. And if somehow I am not doing that, I am not racist. No, right? And here's the thing. Racist culture in our country is the water we breathe. We all kind of just live in it, right? And so we do racist things without even realizing it, right? I'll give you an example. I attended the University of Minnesota. I am a 6'3" Black male. But I was also attending the University of Minnesota on an academic scholarship, right? And so at the beginning of every semester, you go down to the bookstore to get your books based on your scholarship. And without fail, at least a couple of times a year when I would go to get my books, I would show up to the scholarship line to request my books. And the first question they would always ask me is basketball or football? Right? So the idea that as a 6'3" Black male, I could not be on scholarship for anything else is absurd, right? And I would promptly correct them and say, no, actually academics, right? And I didn't hold it against them. I just realized that's the world I live in, and it's our job to teach each other, right? And that's why it's important what schools we send our kids to. Right? If your kids is allowed to attend a diverse district, and I believe Hopkins is that diverse district, right? They can mingle and engage with kids of various backgrounds, immigrants, various race and ethnicities and religion, and they can learn a lot by just showing up and learning naturally. And they'll have a sense of value kind of placed on other people and respecting those people for who they are, that we can't just teach, at home by ourselves, because we all look like each other at home typically, right? And so it's really important to let the community teach, let the school teach each other, and just have a learning experience around race and how it impacts us all by continually community sharing of experiences. And school's a great place to facilitate that.
Thank you both. And I just wanted to give a reminder to the audience that you can submit additional questions to the chat, and we'll be taking questions from the audience at the end.
Thank you, Ari. What measures should be taken at schools to build an anti-racist community, and how can we continue to work at home? Julius, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Building an anti-racist community at school, that's something that we believe very much here in Hopkins. One of our core values is vigilant equity. And that means you have to always be on the lookout for opportunities to interrupt racist practices and things that impact our students of color in a negative way. And here's the thing, racist practices aren't just hurtful to students of color, right? They're hurtful to white kids too, because unfortunately, if you're engaged in racist practices, you begin to reinforce things and this idea of a supremacist value set to white kids unintentionally. And that's why it's important that schools have books where kids can find themselves in and who they are and who they are becoming in all of those texts. And it's important to hire teachers that look like all of the kids, right? That look like all of the kids. It's not okay that just, the building engineers look like the students of color. It's important that the principal looks like them. It's important that the teacher looks like them. It's important that the coach looks like them, right? That is where you start to see and understand whether or not the school district that you send your children to has made a commitment to racial equity and the dismantling of a white supremacist culture. And, we just have to continually challenge that. And, and in the way your kids learn and being able to share experiences, because the truth is we all have cultural experiences. Our white kids do, our Black kids do, our Asian kids do, our Somali kids. All of our kids have experiences and cultural viewpoints that are really rich and are worth sharing with each other. And, and I think we need to create a space in our schools to do that, with people who understand how to navigate those conversations and are not tepid about it.
I so appreciate what you said about the layers of it, because it certainly isn't as simple as there being a diverse space. Like, by no means does that mean the space won't be white in how it conducts business. So I do think that our hiring practices are absolutely a start. And I also think that they are essential, because really, to go beyond that, you have to get to what Julius was just talking about. You have to get to culture. You have to get to how you think, how you interact with people, and you have to be able to examine every single thing you do through that lens, so that you can start to think, well, why do I think this is the way to do it? And why do I notice this person who's different than me is doing it this way? And why does my mind go to a judgment, or why does it not go to a judgment? Like, all of that reflection is part of it. And then that has to be verbalized. That has to be what you're talking about in your staff meetings. That has to be what you're talking about in your classrooms. And when you get to the point where you can have those conversations, then you're ready to tackle curriculum, because curriculum is the biggest perpetuator of white supremacy. Honestly, like, we're all socialized in very specific ways. And so that doesn't mean, and I think white people especially get defensive and think that, well, that means that I'm saying it's wrong. No, I'm saying that it was completely arbitrary to decide whose way of thinking and being was right. And it was not arbitrary. It was based in power, right? And then that power led to these decisions about how we decide whether a student is intelligent, for example. And if you aren't able to reflect at a level where you can think about that, then it's hard to build an anti-racist culture. So I think it starts with those conversations. It starts with when students, I had a student who came in today, and he had been out in the hallway when he should have been in class. And so the conversation I was having with him was about, during a pandemic, that's a different thing, because, like, if someone gets sick, I have to know where every single person that talked to that person was that day, and so it's a little bit different thing. Well, then our dean talked with him a little bit, and he shared, I don't feel comfortable in my classroom. When I come in my classroom, the teacher says, are you going to do work today, or are you going to watch a video? And I was like, well, that changes the whole thing. That changes the whole thing, right? So you can't say, well, this is the rule, and you follow the rule regardless of how the rule impacts you. You have to be willing to say, oh, you're being harmed in that situation. And so the rule takes a back seat. And it's that gray area that's hard for people, because we just want the answer to be simple. We want to be able to say, well, we have the rule, and so we follow the rule at all costs. So I guess the other thing that I would say is an essential element is just being willing to live in ambiguity all the time, to be uncertain, to be thinking you're probably making mistakes or saying it wrong or doing it wrong, and to be okay with that, to be okay with being told that. Right? Because we don't get better unless we fail.
Annie or Ari, can I ask you, what are your thoughts on this, especially in the classroom space and in the school space that you guys experience on a regular basis? What are your thoughts on that?
Ari, do you want to start, or should I?
Yeah, I can start. I would just kind of say, as being like a Black student who's always been in like AP classes or like honors classes, I can relate and say like it is a little uncomfortable, especially like when you kind of feel like you are alone. And like even though I know like I'm capable of being in the class and like I'm smart enough to do the work, just kind of like being singled out or like always asked about the race questions or like always kind of like called on extra is like a little uncomfortable. And I feel like I've had classes with Annie, and if you ask her like, "Oh, is Ari quiet?" She's gonna probably be like, "Yeah, she's really quiet." But if you ask a student who looks like me, they're gonna be like, "No way, like she's never quiet." So I feel like it definitely is a little uncomfortable, and it's something that should be fixed.
Yeah, I think speaking as like a white student, I think it's incredibly important for us to understand what it looks like for teachers to be having these microaggressions towards Black students, for other white students to have these microaggressions and aggressions, and really call that out. I think it takes a voice to call something out, but that's where learning about anti-racism and where that shows up is so important for white students, just to see that and to know that and to really stand up for and with Black students and students of color experiencing any sort of aggression. So I think it starts really with the white students and the white teachers learning and taking the time, reading books, watching TV, talking to their Black peers and colleagues, and really understanding like, where am I seeing my white privilege and how can I dismantle that and really uplift the people of color around me. So I think it's about the personal journey of white people to really understand what it looks like to be in relation with and uplift people of color around them, because I think that's where the change will come from, is white people like seeing where they can change.
And then I would just like to add that it is something that should start young, because I feel like how like a younger child is treated by others who don't look like them will really kind of like lay out how they feel. And like me personally, like I've gone to Hopkins all my life, you know, it's kind of like a little I wouldn't say it's the majority of white people, but there are a lot of white students. So like when it came time for me to like pick my colleges, I only applied to HBCUs because like I just didn't want to go like somewhere. I don't want to say I didn't want to go anywhere like Hopkins, but I did want like a different feeling of like not always being the minority.
I so appreciate that you shared that, Ari. I was thinking about what you said about your AP classes, and I think we have to be aware that if we have spaces where people don't feel they can be their whole self all the time, then that's a problem. And we have to be willing to examine that, and you don't get there unless you listen. So I hope that maybe you'll share some of that with your teachers at some point. I think it would be good for them to understand that, of course, everybody can be quiet at sometimes and joyful and energetic at others, but like they should know all parts of you. And so how do we make sure that that's happening?
Sorry.
You're good, go ahead.
Yeah, when you mentioned that, Ari, it does start at a young age, because students in kindergarten and like first grade, where they being put in classes are like teachers seeing the students of color that are excelling in class and putting them in those positions and in those, what are they like gifted and talented classes? Mm-hmm. Because I think I see that in schools is a lot of white kids from a young age are being put in those classes where we have the same brains. Like there's resources, things are different, but I want to see that change from a young age, is students seeing students of color excelling in classes and putting them in the position to thrive, because that's why you are one of the or in the minority in your AP classes, and it shouldn't be like that.
I agree.
So one thing I want to point out is what I hear you all saying is every single kid in your classes, Black, brown, or white, has a genius to them. It is the teacher's job to cultivate that genius, full stop, right? No ifs, ands, or but about it. Create a space where every single person's voice is heard, including Ari's. She shouldn't have to go quiet because she has a lot to share. Annie, you shouldn't have to go quiet because you have experiences and a lot to share. And those shared ideas should be what we grow from and learn from. And yeah, I think that sums it up right there. That sums it up. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. I had a student ask their history teacher, why do we celebrate Independence Day when African Americans were still slaves? Her history teacher could not give a direct answer. How do we help our students navigate anti-racism in school situations? Leanne, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think that is a brilliant question and one that we should be able to answer, right? And our history doesn't necessarily allow us to, it allows us to answer it, but it doesn't allow us to answer it in a way that makes sense to a child who might be saying, well, then that isn't independence. If we weren't all free, then that isn't independence. So I just think we have a responsibility to teach the truth. We have a responsibility to teach all of history, not just the narrative that we ourselves were taught. And so that's what I hope we're doing. That's what I hope that we are able to do, is interrogate, like I said earlier, interrogate what we think we know and then think again. And students will provide opportunities for us to do that every day. And so I think students need to be encouraged to continue using their voices, to continue asking those questions, to continue pushing the adults, because that is what will get us to move. I know that when I'm wanting my staff to believe in something, sharing with them how students are feeling or thinking about it is powerful. And so listening to our students, and if we don't have answers to questions, being willing to ask ourselves why. Why don't we know the answer to that question? And how do we figure out the answer together?
That's the idea of, coming along on the journey together is a great point, Dr. Kampfe. In thinking of this question, the idea of, Independence Day, right? And everybody knows so last year after the whole George Floyd thing occurred, when June 19th came, we started talking about Juneteenth, right? And so many people hadn't heard of Juneteenth, right? And there was this, I could sense that so many people were learning about Juneteenth for the first time. And so Juneteenth is basically, Lincoln had emancipated Black Americans, at the time slaves, right? 2.5 years before word got to people and Black folks that they were actually free from slavery. And when they found out was 2.5 years later on June 19th. And so this is a holiday that is celebrated in the Black community as Juneteenth. That is our Independence Day in a sense, right? But this is not something that is often taught in schools. There are kids that are growing up that don't recognize it, right? And the truth is, America's history is Black history. It's woven together. America, in a lot of ways, does not exist without the Black folks who came here. And one thing I want to just quickly point out, just the idea of like living in whiteness and living in a racist society, right? A couple of months ago, I was talking to someone and I said the phrase, when the slaves were brought to America, and I had to catch myself. Even I had been programmed to say when the slaves were brought to America. The fact is, when the Black folks were taken and stolen from their land and made slaves in America, they were not slaves and brought to America. They were Black free people in Africa who were brought to America and made slaves. So just the idea that, we are all kind of in this white supremacist type of culture, and it can get into us if we don't understand ways to navigate and live intentionally. So the idea of, teaching, about America's Independence Day should not be somehow separate from Black folks' independence on June 19th and why it took so long to be communicated to us. And even after hearing about it, we still really weren't free, because then we had Jim Crow. And now there are all sorts of other things that are coming into play and showing up in the political realm that reminds a lot of people of the 60s. and all of the struggles that Black folks have had to endure that still exist till this day.
One parent asks, quote, I have a son who is white. He is currently dating a young woman who is Black. I have heard her say to him, with reference to bring the dishes down to the kitchen, that she is not, quote, his slave girl, or that she is running late, quote, it's Black people time. How do I navigate statements like this? Julius, do you want to start?
This is a difficult one, right? I think this is probably, so one thing I want to do is I want to give this parent some credit, right? Because what I can tell they're attempting to do is be racially present and trying to understand that the experience of the young lady, that whatever they may be experiencing in the house may be impacted by race, right? But it's also entirely possible she was joking, but but we have to understand, as Black folks, the idea of race is only so far from our minds, right? Like, it's never that far beyond the surface because we live it so much, and we're always reminded of who we are and how we have to show up in spaces. So, I know for the young lady in their home, she may have been joking, but how much truth was really in that joke, and where was that really coming from? And so I'll give kudos to the mom for realizing that, okay, there's maybe something here, but next time I would encourage her to engage in a conversation, to try to dig a little deeper, to really don't let that opportunity pass you by. Because if you're sensing something, then her spidey senses are definitely going off. So, just engage in the conversation.
I appreciate this question. I'm in a biracial marriage. My husband, Julian, is Liberian. And it was something that we did need to navigate when we first met each other, how each of our families were going to receive one another. And I think what strikes me is whether or not we should be centering white perspective in that moment. And I think that I don't know if I really got that until he and I, until I spent a lot of time with his family, but certainly when we traveled to Liberia, and I got to be the only. And when I'm the only, I'm constantly thinking about my actions, constantly thinking about how I might be perceived, constantly thinking about whether I'm going to do the right thing or the wrong thing. And so I just bring that up because he and I have sons. We've been married for 17 years. So that was, a long time ago that we first had these conversations. But we certainly have grown to the point where we can talk about times when he's uncomfortable because the space is so white, times when he is comfortable because the space is welcoming and accepting. And I think just allowing space, in a relationship as it's developing, for people to be who they are and not have to parse each thing that they say is super important. That, like Julius said, who knows why she said what she said, but I'm not sure that it is for me as a white person to be concerned about that, or to think that I have to know, or to think that I have to fix or understand, right? I think I need to understand her and not have so much importance on the language, but more understanding her and who she is. And that will lead to me understanding how and why she is the way she is, what she says, what she does.
Okay, thank you. How can families help our school district, not Hopkins, move to an anti-racism without progressive leaders in place? Leanne, would you like to start?
I think we all can be advocates at any time. I know as a principal that my stakeholders are many. The children are first and foremost, but the parents are also my stakeholders. And so if you're to come to me as a parent and say, I I really want to see something change here. I really want to see these perspectives brought forward. I really want the space to feel more inclusive. It's my job to listen to that. And so, regardless of whether I, as an individual, am progressive, if you come to me and you say, this is what I need, this is what I believe my child deserves, then I have a duty to think about that, and maybe to think about, well, why haven't I been doing it? And so I would just say, use your voice. And then if you use your voice and things don't go the route that you hope, then make sure you have your child someplace where you do feel like your values are being upheld. Make sure that your child does have the opportunity to be in a space where they are learning about all sorts of people and learning themselves to exist outside of their own lane, to understand how people interact in different ways. So I think, it does start with using your voice, but it also it moves from there to action. What action are you going to take to make sure that is the experience that your child has?
I agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Kampfe on that. I think, if we think of it as, when sending your child to a school, that you are purchasing a product, right? Think of it that way, because people school shop because they want their children to have an experience in the performing arts, or have, be able to speak French. And so you want a French immersion or a Spanish immersion. But what kids also now need to be immersed in is being able to navigate a much more complex world where, they are, not one race is that sort of shouldn't be the one dominant race, and they need to be able to be around many people and feel their humanity affirmed. And so if you're a white family or a Black family, that is a question that you need to be pushing and asking your building leaders in your district to make sure that their values align with yours. And if their values don't align, don't risk it. There's too much at stake to leave up to chance, because if they are not intentionally walking in that belief that you hold so dear to yourself, that the world should be a just place for your kids and other people's children, then that's not going to be compatible, and the results of that may show right away, or it may show down the line in a detrimental way, or, I think this is such an important question, and it's really important that, parents, elevate their voice directly to building leadership or district level leadership and seek what they are asking for.
All right, now we will be opening up questions that were submitted in the chat. The first question is,
what are productive ways to respond to white people who suggest that talk of racism, bias, equity, etc. is just a ploy to make them feel guilty?
I can start there. I think that there's a whole book about white guilt or white fragility. And I think that it comes back to helping people ask themselves why. So why do you feel guilty? And does you feeling guilty mean that we shouldn't do anything about it? How do you think people of color feel on a daily basis about the way that our country interacts with them? So I think it's that personal reflection piece, being willing to have the conversation. So not allowing guilt to shut it down, but also not shaming in a way that shuts that person down, because no one grows if they don't actually start to think about it and talk about it. And so I would just say, that's a time to pause and say, tell me more about that. Tell me what makes you feel guilty. And then let the conversation go from there.
Yeah. The idea of guilt, right? I get that when the conversation around race come up, a lot of people will feel guilt because it's uncomfortable for them. But, to Leanne's point, remember, the Black, brown, and indigenous people of this country are constantly uncomfortable because the country was not built for them. A space does not be carved out for them to exist in. So if you're uncomfortable, they're exhausted. So keep that in mind. And I think, one example I shared with my staff recently when we were having conversations around race was I said, one of our core values here in Hopkins is love, right? And I told them, picture who you love the most, right? Who do you love the most? And if that person who you love the most called you at, 2 a.m. and said, I am hurt. I am on the side of the freeway. I said, you would be in your PJ pants and in your flip-flops and be in your car in a heartbeat. You would do anything for them. So if you're feeling guilt for something, consider asking yourself this. The person you are engaging with, do you love them? Do you care enough to do something uncomfortable or inconvenient for them in that moment? And if you're able to answer yes, then set your guilt aside and focus on the love you have for them as the powering kind of thing for you that allows you to do what you need to do. So, Black people, our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, we can't do this by ourselves. We need our white allies to have our backs and to continue pushing for things that make the lives of our kids better. Because I think one thing we can all agree to as parents is the idea that we have accepted what our realities are, right? What we want to do now is change the reality of our kids. And so for that reason, we cannot be tired and we cannot let guilt disable us and paralyze us, because our kids shouldn't have to deal and continue to have these crazy conversations like we've had to have.
Yeah, I think white guilt is really real. I think I've felt that from like a young age of so differently than students of color around me. And, I think that it's so good to just call it out and like accept it, because I think it's honestly a good thing. It shows people are paying attention. They see what's wrong. And with that guilt comes like hopefully some change instead of just trying to shove that down or blame it on someone else. And I think when white students feel that guilt, they can often put it on other things. And that guilt is a signal for change. So with our next question, how do parents address observations of racism and racial slurs with their children or children's friends? Either Leanne or Julius, take this one.
Could you ask the question again, Annie? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I can. Mm-hmm. How do parents address observations of race and racial slurs with their children or children's friends?
Absolutely put a stop to it. What we cannot do is normalize those kind of things, right? We cannot normalize, something that is said in such a throwaway manner, thinking, well, we just say it to each other, right? It unintentionally reinforces dangerous stereotypes that are harmful to other people and harmful to kids and to people of color, right? And so we can't just act in a callous way around it. As adults, we have to referee this and we have to monitor it. And we have to take these opportunities to engage, our kids about what they are able to say and what they cannot say, right? I once shared with my staff that the idea of people wanting to say the N-word or something like that, white kids or white people in general wanting to say that, is that idea of I am entitled to every single thing. And so because I am entitled to every single thing, why am I not entitled to this one word? It is the one forbidden thing that white people aren't allowed to touch, right? And some people still struggle with it. And that is because there's a sense of entitlement that comes with being a part of the dominant culture, right? And so we have to teach our kids that it's important to honor that these words are hurtful to other people. And for that reason, we will not touch them because we are not entitled to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your theory about entitlement, 100%. And that, you have to put a stop to it. And I was thinking in a very literal sense, like in that moment, what would I do, right? And to me, it always comes back to conversation. And so depending on how it all went down, maybe I say something right then and there. Maybe I pull that child aside and say, hey, I'd really like to talk to you for a minute about what I just heard. Certainly, I connect with that child's parents and let them know this isn't how we're going to talk at my house, and let them know why. Here's the impact that has, and here's why that just isn't the way that we're going to engage. So I think it's, as I pictured myself giving the answer, I thought, and people will think, oh my gosh, how uncomfortable. Yep. And that's probably, like Annie said earlier, that guilt is like that signal, that discomfort is the signal of, yep, you probably need to move forward. That's probably what you need to do. You need to confront that discomfort, because if you don't, just like Julius said, then you are normalizing that language. You're saying that language is okay.
Thank you for that. How can and how will we do a better job of integrating our classes and friend groups, and do a better job of informing culturally literate students and staff members?
What I think, when Annie said earlier what she said about the gifted and talented program, when students come to us, preschool or kindergarten, they're these whole little beings. And then we start this process of sorting. And if we just stopped right there and everybody got to be, like Julius said, a genius, because everyone is, and we really were open to think about, well, what does that look like? That would be the end of it. Reality of our world is, if you are a person working in a junior high, students come to me at 7th grade, and maybe some of the sorting has already happened, and they've certainly had life experiences that have impacted that whole child that they were, to maybe not feel as whole by the time they get to me. And that does not mean that it's too late or that we do nothing by any means. Some of the things that we have done here at West are to eliminate forms of tracking that resulted in spaces that were largely white or largely students of color by academic sorting. So that's one of the ways. I think another thing that I've done with my staff to try to support their learning is to, every year since I've been here, bring in a good friend of mine who's also a fabulous PD clinician, Calvin Terrell, to work with them. And I'm seeing that growth over time. The conversations that we are having this year are very different than the conversations that we had 4 years ago. So I think you have to be willing to invest the time. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable. When we made the decision to detrack, I worried about what our family is going to say. And I also felt it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. So I think that we have to be willing to put ourselves out there. We have to be willing to take what might feel like a risk, because otherwise, I think that goes back to what Julius said earlier about, it's not just hurting our Black and brown kids, it's hurting our white kids too. I think that's what gets lost so much, is that if I choose not to engage, I am dehumanizing myself. I am making myself callous, numb to the pain of other people, to the negative impact on other people. And that isn't good for me either. So we need to kind of believe in like what's on the other side of that discomfort as being the bigger thing, as being what we can work toward, as being the moment that we need to support and experience the discomfort in order to get there.
The only thing I want to add is really just a shout out. I want to shout out all of my colleagues in the Hopkins district, including Leanne, and our teachers here at North and West at the high school and all of the elementaries, that I know we have been having these uncomfortable conversations. We've engaged in it. We haven't backed away from it. And they show up every day when we make decisions like Leanne talk about detracking our kids, right? And letting that natural wanting of, that natural need to understand one another continue to remain, even from kindergarten through the schooling experience here in Hopkins. So, I am I am new to Hopkins, but I am proud to be here, understanding and knowing that my colleagues here are committed in a huge way in the very same things I am committed to.
The next question is, how does implicit bias affect our interactions?
Yes, implicit bias. So there are things that we just do because we see someone and we think something of them, right? So one question I want to ask everyone right now: how many of you have been sitting in a parking lot? That's listening. You've been sitting in a parking lot, and maybe you're on your phone waiting on someone, and a Black person walks by your car. You don't move. You just lift a finger and you hit the auto lock in your car. Have you done that? That is implicit bias, right? The idea, and here's the thing, you didn't have to think about it deeply. You didn't have to be super calculated about it. It was just instinctively. You felt some level of danger somehow because a Black person was walking by. And so implicit bias shows up in so many different ways. And that's just one example. But I think it's really an opportunity when those moments happen and you've already lifted that finger and hit the auto lock. Don't let that moment pass you by without reevaluating why you were afraid of someone you knew nothing about. And ask yourself, if that was a white person who had walked by, would I have auto locked or would I have waved and said hello as if they were walking a poodle, right? So think about that. These are the things that we have to be deeply aware of.
I love that example. That example is so perfect. And I think what's important to remember that implicit bias is always going to be present. I don't know if it's even possible to eradicate it. I think what is possible is to be aware of it, to recognize it. So like Julius said, if you've hit the lock button, pause and ask yourself why you did that. And the next time, if you feel the urge, stop yourself and don't do it, right? So I really think it's like being aware of it. And then if you are aware of it, then you have this enormous opportunity in moments where you as an individual have power to use it for the good. I think when we're not aware of it, then there's millions of decisions we're making all day that are just continuing to reinforce that bias. Versus being aware of it, you can start to interrupt it in yourself, and then you can start to take actions that will help others interrupt it as well. But that first step is like acknowledging it was there. I said earlier, we have to interrogate everything. We have to ask ourselves, why do I do the things I do? What leads me to say the thing I say? And it's not always going to be about implicit bias, but if we're not willing to just be constantly asking that question, there are so many things that we're going to miss.
Thank you. Is Hopkins curriculum starting to talk about / educate kids about different celebrated holidays such as Juneteenth?
Absolutely. So for us, this is a conversation we're constantly engaging in, right? In our building, we're trying to change the traditional way that education looks. The idea that a teacher simply stands in front of kids and just orates to them and talks directly at them, right? Without allowing them to engage, right? And so what we are trying to do is create an environment where kids can bring their own history into the learning process. This will allow kids to naturally seek out things that is relevant to them culturally and meaningful to them. And they can teach it to themselves and teach it to their friends and classmates. And then this allows the teacher to be not just a teacher, a facilitator, but also a learner, right, in that space with the kids. And so things like Juneteenth will naturally show up in curriculum and in classroom experiences because there are kids in that space that Juneteenth means something to. And they will also find value in July 4th as well when they are able to appreciate Juneteenth for what it is.
I immediately thought of the fact that our two junior high schools are International Baccalaureate MYP or middle years program schools. And why that's important is that the focus, and it's a long journey because it has meant completely changing the way that we think about education and completely changing the way that we do education. But the focus is on concepts. And so instead of me teaching facts, instead of me teaching about July 4th, I may be teaching about celebration. I'm teaching about big ideas that, like Julius said, every student in the room can relate to that in a different way. And then we are able to hear that from each other. And so it does push the adult to be the learner, because whatever I went into thinking I knew, I'm going to know something different, something more, if I listen to the voices in the room. And so for me, that has been really, really pivotal. And it's hard. It's hard work. I can only speak for me, but the examples I've seen with the rest of the educators I know resonate that is not the way I was taught. That was not the way I was taught as a student. That's not the way that I was taught to be an educator. And so to undo all of that thinking and be able to come to a place where you just are really looking at things from a very open perspective requires a lot of personal effort. But I'm seeing that happening in our classrooms, and that's what's opening the door for all students to be their whole selves, for all students to be able to talk about who they are and to learn about who their classmates are.
There's one thing I want to bring up really quick is specifically to the different holidays that are celebrated at Hopkins and around the world. I think Hopkins can continue to work on recognizing holidays that are outside of Christian ones. And really, I have seen a change, and I think we can continue to change even as a country. But still this year, my friends that are Jewish have struggled with getting assignments and tests changed for days that they have different holidays. And so I think as a school, I would like to see a continued change in recognizing these holidays. And I see that happening, and I'm really grateful that it is. So that's just one thing I wanted to bring up really quick. All right, so our next question is, have we explored a Hopkins School District allyship program?
I'm not sure that we have, and quite clearly we should. No, but what has been really exciting over the last several years are the different partnerships that, as our leadership has become more and more diverse, we've started to see all sorts of partnerships developing. So one that I'm thinking about that I think just was this weekend, it was a former Hopkins student came in to talk about a program called Teacher Prodigy, I believe it is. And it's a program where students develop the curriculum. I know that we have been working with an organization called Black Men Teach. So we are starting to develop partnerships with different groups, but I think similar to your answer, Annie, about the holidays, there's absolutely room for more growth. And to that end, I am so thrilled that your Principal Ballard, was thinking we had a conversation a few weeks ago about prom and Ramadan. And I know that that's been an ongoing conversation at the high school, and just being able to acknowledge, I mean, you're so right that everything is based on a Christian tradition, and then exceptions are what we call everything else. And it shouldn't be an exception, then everything's an exception, right? So I'd like to know more about an allyship program.
I agree with Dr. Kampfe on that. I would absolutely love to know more about that. One thing I have noticed since being here in Hopkins is the fact that our scholars have engaged me in being just straightforward about it. Hey, Mr. Eromosele, we need this here, right? Like, we don't have a Black student union. Our Asian scholars need support in this way, and they are upfront about it. And they, and when that conversation, and they're advocating for themselves and for their classmates. And so we, as leaders, are also learners in this process. there are things we may not know or may not be aware of, and we are finding out about these things through you all and from our families. And that's why it's so important for our families to stay engaged, because, we may have parents who are part of other organizations that could, be very impactful in our school community, that we could partner with. And so if those parents and organizations are out there, reach out to us, reach out to, our district and building leaders, and see if there's an opportunity for us to make a change in our community.
Thank you. What should I do when I witness a racist encounter? And what if I'm not sure of their intent? I do not want to get into any trouble.
So I would, so here's the thing, focus first on, is it right? Is it wrong? We all have that compass within us, right? We all have that compass within us. Often when it comes to race type incidents, some people won't view it as wrong because it's happening to a brown skinned person or a Black person or an Asian person or someone from a different religious background. So somehow it's less wrong when it happens to other people. So take that out of the equation. Focus on, is it wrong? Like, if that was happening to someone who is white or looks like you, would you consider it wrong? And if you feel like it is, then you need to find a way to interrupt it. Don't be guilty. Speak to an adult you can trust so that they can help you interrupt it, okay? Talk to a teacher, talk to, a paraprofessional, talk to your parents about it, someone who you're comfortable with. You should not have to carry that level of guilt by watching something that is not right happen and feeling guilty, even though you did not commit the act, but now you have to now carry the burden of watching it occur without interrupting it. That is not fair to you. The only way to lift that off of you is to engage and talk to someone. And we all need help and guidance in navigating some of these things. And sometimes we need to partner with other people to lighten the load. Figure out who you can partner with to have your load lighten. You don't have to carry or walk this by yourself.
I'm reminded of the quote I shared from my friend about being good story makers. I think that if our children don't know what to do in those moments, it's because we have not shown them what to do. We have not normalized interrupting that behavior. We have not normalized that, yeah, of course you speak up, right? We've normalized that you don't. We've normalized that you ignore it, that you walk away, or maybe you go tell somebody, but you don't say something in that moment. And that's from children all the way to adults. And so we've been working on this in our school with children and adults. And so if an adult comes to one of us as an administrator and says, I have this concern about this thing I saw, we talk with them about how will you go and address that concern? How will you go to your colleague and have that conversation? So it's again about that conflict avoidance. And if you don't want to assume intent, then ask questions. I ask the person there how they feel about it. That's the other thing I was thinking about. Like, if I'm the one who's being insulted, if I'm the one who is the target of the racist encounter, what do I hope someone will do for me, right? Do I want them to just walk away? Or do I hope that they'll speak up and say something?
I've heard kids say that they're afraid of talking about race because they're scared of saying the wrong thing and being misunderstood. How do I encourage them to have these conversations?
I know that it's supposed to be Julius and I answering the questions, but I'm super curious about what the two of you think about this. Like, does that happen to you? And do you feel like people say things that are wrong? And like, are those conversations that students are having, or do we need to do a better job of teaching them to how to even have the conversation to begin with?
Ari, do you want to go or should I?
If you could start, that'd be great.
Okay. So the question is about like students and kids being afraid to have conversations around race if they like get it wrong, and like that's scary. And I do think like when you ask that question, Leanne, like are we like preparing students for these questions? I've never actually thought about that. You know, are we? I'm thinking back to elementary school, middle school, and have I sat down in a classroom and had a teacher say like, yes, I've had conversations about race, but how to have them? I feel like that hasn't happened. I think I've learned on my own and been in relationship with people and had these conversations with my friends and peers. And as in high school, I think a lot more conversations surrounding race. But I don't feel like everyone has been prepared in the same way and are in different families having different conversations. So I think that there is growing in that. And encouraging students to have conversations surrounding race is, are we seeing adults having these conversations? And then that like kind of gives us the okay to. And I think it's scary having conversations, but the more we have it, the easier it comes and the less people are having to experiencing things from these conversations. What are you thinking, Ari?
Okay, so I'm trying to think back of a time where I've actually had a conversation about race in class other than being after like a traumatic event. And I'm honestly blanking on it. I don't think I recall having just normal conversations about race. I kind of feel like it really depends on what classes you take and kind of like your teacher and like whether or not they have that conversation with you. But I will say this term I was actually able to participate in a global back literature class. And there also are white students in the class, and we have had multiple conversations about race. And I feel like the environment has been very comfortable. Like when the student speaks, no one like really kind of interrupts them or no one like jumps on them and tells them they're wrong. And I kind of feel like the course is really good because the people in the class, like we've all known each other. So we're able to hear each other out. And I would say like another class where that happens is Avid, where like race conversations happen all the time because we're like always talking about college and other things. And I feel like that's another good example where it's like I've had my white peers like speak up and like ask questions and be comfortable with sharing. So I would really say it kind of starts with like the teacher and like the environment that they build for the classroom, because in some classrooms you'll never talk about it and in other classrooms you'll talk about it all the time, just depending on how comfortable like the environment is for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the change that I want to see, well, there's a lot of change, but specific to this, would be like it seems like there has to be like a special place for conversations around like race, and like backgrounds. And I don't want there to have to be these like special spots, like students or teachers sitting students down and being like, okay, today we're going to talk about whatever, like I think casually like talking about it, because everyone experiences it day to day, especially at Hopkins when you're surrounded by so many different people. I think I want that change to be just casually talking about it. And I know it's not a casual conversation all the time, but not having to have these like sit down, like after a traumatic event, like let's just talk about it. What are we experiencing? What are we seeing in our school? And I think teachers are doing that and continue to have these conversations with students.
And then like another thing I would like to add is like more so heavy talking about the teacher. It helps to have students go to teachers who don't look like them and teachers who do look like them. Like I mentioned earlier, I went to West and North. And while I was at West, it's kind of like, because it's trafficked by the elementary school. So it's like some schools go here, some schools go there. And like I kind of went to a predominantly white elementary school. I went to Gatewood. So when I got to West, I was always around elementary schools who were also predominantly white. So when I got to North, 9th grade year, it was like a totally different like world. And it's like really shouldn't be like that because they're the same district and the same schools. But at North, it's like I seen teachers who looked like me. I seen hall pairs who looked like me. And it kind of like really changed the environment of the school. And like I kind of, not to shade West, but North was a school where I kind of felt more comfortable at. And like just seeing people who looked like me and just being around students who also have been comfortable around other students who look like me, like kind of really changed the ball game.
I really appreciate your honesty, Ari. And I wasn't the principal when you were here, but that doesn't change anything of what you're saying. I think that I can say that I see those things, and we're working hard to make that different. We're working hard to make sure that we do have employees that look like our students, and that and West has shifted in the last couple of years with regard to its student population, and so now West and North are equally diverse, but that was not the case for a really long time. And I know that when I taught here, that was absolutely not the case. And that does matter. I think back to like my husband, who I mentioned is Liberian, and I used to be a music teacher, and there was a certain organization that I worked with where I did a lot of concerts that I was conducting. And at a certain point, he told me he didn't want to go with me anymore because everyone there was white and it just wasn't comfortable for him. Right. So I think that's so huge. Like, we just have to really be aware of that it's human nature to feel more comfortable with people that we believe are like us. And so our spaces need to reflect our students so that all of our students can walk through the door and feel like they belong.
Thanks for saying all of that, Leanne, because I think, Leanne and I have been very intentional in our partnership across both buildings to make sure that the experience that our kids are having here at North and the experiences that kids are having at West are lifting all of our kids, right? And we're also we're constantly in conversation along with the high school Principal Ballard, about what our kids need, because we realize that our buildings are not separate as a district. We're very much tied together. And whether you came from West or you came from North, you're going to the same high school. And for that reason, and you're going to share a space, you're going to share a classroom. And so we have a level of responsibility to make sure that the experiences you're getting puts you on an even playing field when you arrive at the high school to Miss Ballard, right? And the teachers up there. And so we are very intentional in that upward alignment of planning and hiring practices and conversations that we're having with our staff and our colleagues across the district.
Thank you for that. This will be our last question of the night. Let's leave about 5 minutes for this one. How do parents start these conversations, and how does that change depending on the age of their children?
I don't think you can start too early, would be the first thing that I would say. I think that depending on what your household looks like, that you may need to diversify your students or your child's experience, right? So I'm thinking of my sister, who is white, and her husband, who is white, and their daughter, who is white, and the need for her to make sure that they are not only listening to music or watching television or reading books that reflect them, but doing things that engaging in those ways that reflect all people. I think that starts to open the door. I also think that ensuring your child is attending a school where they are going to be around lots of different people. Children will be naturally curious, naturally inquisitive. They will ask those questions. And so I don't even know if you have to bring it up. I think they'll do that for us. It's that we have to be ready to talk with them. And then I think, I think it's getting at their thinking, because the innocence of a child, they'll be honest about biases that they're already starting to develop, but they'll also be honest about bias that they don't have. And if we can listen to that and hear that and then cultivate that, keep them in that space, right? Ensure that we're providing opportunities for them to continue seeing the world with really open eyes. So I just think that it's being willing to take every moment as a learning moment. Every opportunity you have to talk about it and to ask your child what they think about it and to share what you think about it, and maybe to share your own processing. Like, I used to think this and now I think that, and here's why. Like all of that is part of helping children develop their consciousness around this.
Absolutely. And, as parents, I have a 5 and a 3-year-old and 2 Black boys, right? So I have to begin that racial literacy for them early because I have to get them ready for a world that may not accept them as who they are, the funny, silly kids who are just rambunctious and like running all over the place at night and I'm chasing, right? The world may not see that. So, I think as parents, when it's important, being silent at times can be the loudest sound. So if you don't say anything, that can end up actually being much louder because to your child, because we through this conversation, we've talked about the idea of, conversations about race feeling uncomfortable. If you don't talk about it, it absolutely will become uncomfortable for them the older they get. So when they're really young, maybe focus on the moral of what you're experiencing in the world. Like focus on the broader, zoom out, right? Talk about the general idea of what they should be picking up. Like we love everyone if they're really young, right? We care about people no matter what they look like, and point to people in their lives to say, they may look different, but we love them anyway. And let them take that in. And the older they get into, elementary school, add more detail to it. And then by the time you're in the junior high and senior high level, then you can really dig deep into it. But by the time you're doing that, you've already laid that framework that allows them to understand the moral view of it, the structures of it, and then the details of it and why and how systematically you could disassemble racism.
Okay. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their insights tonight, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
If you have any additional questions for our speakers, you can find Leanne and Julius's contact information on the screen.
We have prepared an extensive list of additional resources on tonight's topic that can be accessed for free by filling out a survey with your feedback about tonight's event and ideas that you may have for future events. The survey link can be found at hopkinsschools.org/anti-racism, and anti-racism is one word in this. And the link will be entered in the YouTube chat and will be emailed to you after the event.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.